Hello, everyone, and I want to thank everybody who has subscribed to my videos. I really enjoy seeing all those views tick off. Um, I really hope that you are learning things as much as I'm learning how to play the game. Um, I would like to see that you guys are learning things about tanks. So what we're going to do is this is going to be a different video from the other ones. There's not going to be much gameplay at all, if any. I don't think we're going to have any. Um, but what we're going to do is we're going to go down the line of tanks that exist in the game but are as part of a lineage. And you can see a lot of different design elements that make that tank part of the whole. So we're going to start actually with the Super HELLCAT. And the reason why I'm showing you the Super HELLCAT is because that's the one in my garage. But the M18 HELLCAT is a very famous American tank. It's definitely easily recognizable. And those of you who may have gone to D-Day Conneaut or any of the other areas where a company called World War II Armor is doing demonstrations, they have one of these, and it's amazing to see running. It's a great tank, but this is going to be a start of our lineage. This is what America's answer was to the heavy tanks that Germany had fielded right at the beginning of the war. They wanted a tank that could punch through that armor, could put rounds downrange, and get out of dodge. And that was our M18 HELLCAT. And if you know anything about the Shermans, this is a completely different suspension model. This was the start of our line that we're trying to get to. The torsion bar suspension allowed for the heavier tanks that we're going to be seeing in our line, and it allowed for a little bit more flexibility. But the most important part is that it allowed for standardization. And that's one of the big things that people look at tanks and they see, well, in the German tree, there's all kinds of different tanks with all kinds of different suspensions and all kinds of stuff. Standardization is the key to producing upgradable vehicles, chassis that can be manipulated to fulfill different purposes. So here we are at the M18. This was a stopgap measure. This was a tank that was designed as quickly as possible from taking elements of the M24 Chaffee, elements of the M10 tank destroyer, and merging them together and making a fast little tank destroyer. So the reason why this is the focus of the beginning of our line is that torsion bar suspension. So just remember that as we keep going. The next vehicle in our line is the T-26 E3 heavy tank. This was considered a heavy tank by the American military during World War II. It is considered a medium tank in World of Tanks only because it is a M26 T-26 variant. It is essentially a heavy tank. It was slow. It had more heavy armor than any other American tank that had been fielded at the time. Fielded. And it had a better gun than any American heavy tank, or any American tank had been fielded at the time, besides the M36 Jackson, which we'll get to that later. In fact, this is the same gun that was fielded on the M36 Jackson and was also proposed for the M18 HELLCAT. It's the 90mm M3. But this is where the real meat of our lineage starts. The T26 was a design that worked, and that's one of the things that really influences tanks and airplanes and stuff like that. When you get a design that works, you'll go with it and you use it as much as you possibly can. And we'll see later on down the line where deviating from that, where did it go? Where deviating from that can cause some issues. So the T-26 was successful in that it was deployed in World War II towards the end, and it was able to perform its job. It was able to take out Tigers and Panthers and all kinds of stuff. This tank is actually a model of the one in that famous video that you'll see online of Panthers driving and ducking and dodging in Cologne. This actually strikes the killing blow on the Panther. It's a really interesting video, and it was actually the first tank combat video that I'd ever seen, and it was really amazing. So that's the T-26. Next tank in our line is the M26, which is the Pershing. The Pershing is basically the late war, or the after-war variant of the T-26. As the war came to a close, the desire for a heavy tank was no longer really needed, but people were really analyzing tanks' roles on the battlefield. And one of the things that American leadership looked at was the fact that their strategy that they adopted during the war, which was fast, mobile tank destroyers, worked really well. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to enhance the T-26 E3 in such a way that made it faster, made it lighter, but also increased its gun. So you had tanks like the T-26 E4, which was produced during wartime. That was the opposite direction. It had a much longer gun, but it was slower and it was bulkier and it was difficult to run. This was the M26. This is the production variant of the prototype T-26 E3. This one would have enhanced turret armor. It would have available to it the let me actually put it on there, the much longer and much more accurate 90mm T-15 E2, and it was just an all-around good, solid tank. This tank would go on to serve during the interim period between 1945 and the Korean War, and it did its job very well. But the American military was still developing a lot of technologies, and the next tank that we see in our lineage is going to be an exemplary variant of the M26. And that's the M46. The M46 was an attempt to just continue the development of the M26, and it ended up coming out with a completely different tank. It was upgraded in so many different ways that they classified it from the M26 to the M46. You'll notice that the gun is back to the 90mm M3. The T-15 E2 would put a lot of stress on the turret ring and the gun elevation and depression mechanisms, so they dialed it back. But you'll notice that the turret, the hull, and the running gear is very similar, with the notable addition of one little road wheel here, and that was just a lesson learned that sometimes the track could get bunched up here and it would cause issues. So they put an extra road wheel there. The M46 was our primary vehicle during Korea. It was used to great effect, and it was one of the best tanks in the world at the time. In fact, I have here a replica that I made myself. Yep, I made it myself. This is the M46 painted up in the Tiger variant that they would use for the Korean conflict. And the reason why they did this is because they wanted the Koreans to get in their T-34-85s and come take these guys on, because they knew that these were superior to the T-34-85s. And so they wanted to get into a tank fight. And so that's the M46. And really, that was the most that was the best conflict that the M46 really was in. There was a few other deployments of the M46 during that time, but really the Korean War was over before we came out with the next tank that we're going to talk about on our list, and the M46 did its duty, and it performed very well. You will see some of these out on display in front of VFWs and National Guard armories, but these are substantially rarer than some of the other tanks on our list. So that's the M46. Now the next one in our list, which I'm going to grab mine from up here, and we're going to talk about it first, is actually a variant that we can produce by looking at our M46 here. So we're going to make our M47. Boom! And boom. M47. So the M47 was an attempt to put new fire control systems, create a little bit of extra space, a little bit more ammo capacity in the turret, and it was a attempt also to kind of bring up a little bit more better performing gun. This was an abysmal failure. Depending on who you talk to in military units, this tank was horrible. They hated it. It was underpowered. The turret put a lot of stress on the turret turning mechanism. It was prone to breakdowns. It was universally disliked. And I have my my example of the M47 here as well. But what we're going to look at mostly is our Lineage here. You can see that my game's having some sound troubles, but you can see here where you still got that additional road wheel. It's basically an M46 that's been upgraded slightly. The turret, the engine deck looks about the same. The exhaust look about the same. I don't see very much different except the turret here, and that was the problem. The turret was an attempt to enhance something, and it didn't really work. Um, Not much else to actually to talk about. These were distributed to units. These were distributed to Germany. And they were sold to multiple different countries. However, the most notable use of these tanks is not in warfare or any sort of military capacity. This was actually most notably used during a really well, I can't say terrible because the movie's not bad, but it's during the movie Battle of the Bulge. They used these to represent German tanks. Yep, you heard that right. This is a German tank. Moving on. The M47 wasn't bad. It wasn't good though. It wasn't a improvement over the original M46. So now that we're finally through the M46 and M47, we can get to our M48. And I have that in the garage, so we can look at that without the weird sound issues. So, M48. This was the replacement for the M47. It was definitely needed. The M47 was underwhelming. This was a complete redesign, as you can tell. The only thing kept are the standardized road wheels. As you can readily see there, they're the standard type that you see even today on M1A1s. Most notably, you'll notice that the hull is rounded, and it, rather than having the side-by-side seating that you see on the M46 and the M47, you have a single seat in the front for the driver, and you see a much rounder, more bulbous turret, and actually less road wheels. And if you remove that little straggler there, the M48 originally came out with a 90mm gun, just like the M46 and the M47. At this time, the 90mm gun was the only gun that America knew how to make, besides on much larger vehicles. They really didn't know how. We didn't really don't know how to put them in put larger guns in smaller vehicles. It was just terrible. All the guns that we tried with that ended up being howitzers or absolutely horrible. Here's my example of my M48. This is made to represent the war that the M48 was most notably used in, which was Vietnam. As you can see, this is a nice small short 90mm gun that was provided for the original M48, and while this vehicle was very good, it was definitely a very good platform, it still suffered a lot of the woes that the M47 had, in that it still mounted the 90mm gun, which was starting to get a little bit underwhelming for the Russian tanks that it would have to face if it ran into combat, and the original variants were very underpowered. They had the similar engine deck to the M46 and the M47 because they had a similar engine, just slightly bigger. Moving to the M48A3 and onward, they upgraded the engine, and you'll see this engine deck here with this big bulge in the center. This is the upgraded engine, and I believe the one in the game is the correct one, the AV 1790 7B. The engine is really woke this tank right up. It made it so that it was mobile. It made it so that it could it was more fuel efficient, and it basically made it so that this tank was effective. And that's the one thing that tanks need to be, is effective. And on the battlefield, tank without any fuel is not an effective tank. So the M48 was the next step forward. And in Vietnam, these tanks were fighting against T-34-85s that were being used by the North Vietnamese, and you saw some T-55s, but these really didn't get to be what they were. They were basically more mobile artillery platforms, and the 90mm was not good for that. So that led us and a lot of the world's countries to move on to the tank that we're going to end this video on. But I need to talk about another tank before we go any further. The M48 is the start of several lineages here. The first one is the M103, which, let's bring that up in the game here. The M103 is the only true heavy tank that, if I can get the garage to update, that we ever fielded. This was an M48 that was basically just strapped on with a bigger turret, and the hull was extended, the turret bustle was improved. It was specifically designed by request by the Marine Corps. They wanted a heavy tank to use against the heavier Russian vehicles, some of the heavier vehicles that they were believing that they were going to encounter, because Russia was very closed off. We didn't know what they had. The last thing that we saw that they had was the IS-3, and that thing was ridiculous. So we were really believing that we were going to run into some big problems. So we had the 105mm gun, we had the 120mm gun that we experimented with on things like the T-30 and the T-34 and the what am I saying? Anyway, but this tank saw service with the Marine Corps at the same time that the M48 was in service. It was definitely useful for what it was used for at the time, but it didn't go much further than that, because it was basically a big steel bar driving around that even the Marine Corps who requested it didn't really like the requirements that took to move it around. So it eventually would see the shelf as this last tank that we're going to talk about was designed. And that tank was the quintessential American vehicle at the end of the Cold War, and that is our M60. The M60 was the developmental progression of the M48, the M103, the protective armor plates that had been developed, and the different armor types that were being put into production. This was the culmination. The M48 had a boat-shaped cast hull. That's because it was all steel. The turret that you saw on the M48 was rounded and whatnot. It's because it was all cast and it was all steel. The M60 started to incorporate the composite armor, which included a ceramic layer in the middle. And the variant that's in the game is an early M60. This is going to be an M60, probably A1 at most. And it still has the M48 turret on it, but the most important thing is that the hull was redesigned so that it was flatter and it had better armor protection on the front. The engine pack was fully integrated into the new design. It was slightly more compact. It was definitely built, the tank was definitely built for that engine pack now. And the gun was a 105 millimeter L7 designed by Germany. This was the best gun we had available to us at the time when we designed the M60. Shortly after the M60 was put into production, the M60 turret was redesigned, and you'll see that in my model here. You'll see that the turret is a little bit more angular, like you can see that little ridge there. And this was basically to make it easier for them to put the composite armor in there. And it was also easier to design the rangefinder and some of the crew emplacements in the vehicle. The most important thing, like if you're trying to identify an M48 versus an M60, look at this front of the hull. Again, it's a nice straight line. That's because you have the beak with the composite armor versus the steel armor that's all cast into the boat-shaped hull. And then look at the turret, because you'll see some M60s have the turret that you see on the screen here, and some M60s will have this nice shaped turret. Most of the M60s that you saw during the Gulf War were M60s like this one that were upgraded with the Blazer armor package, which was what those bolt-on parts that you see. Those are reactive armor blocks designed to defeat heat rounds. But the other notable change is our cupola turret here. This was designed to protect the commander so that he didn't have to get out of the vehicle in order to see around. But from what I am aware of, most commanders preferred to throw up in that hatch and look around anyway, because the view range within that turret was not all that great. And I mean, the M48 here, the model that I have here, has an early variant of that. They didn't really like it then, and they really didn't like it with the M60. So that's why you won't see it on things like the M1A1. You will see certain armor plates that they will put on the ones that you see in Iraq and stuff like that, but those are additional armor pieces put on later. These proved to be more trouble than they were worth. So that's the T26 E3 through the M60, and you saw all the family lineage. You see the running gear is very similar. They all have several things in common. First and foremost is the standard torsion bar running gear. You have the engine and transmission in the back. You have a mid turret, and you have a 90 to 105 millimeter gun. Thanks everyone for watching. This is Tank Historian, and I hope to see you soon in my next video. Thank you.